Now, today was the next layer, and this is all about how standards stay high without constant presence of you, without you needing to hover. And we do this not through control, again, not through hovering or micromanaging, but through simple, intentional structure. When standards are clear, triggers are obvious, feedback creates visibility, and reviews happen on purpose, then quality does not slip. What happens is it stabilises and your practice starts to become world class, as does your leadership. Now, if this episode helped you see where structure is missing, then don't rush to try and fix everything. Choose one area, decide once, and let the practice carry it forward. Good morning. Good afternoon and good evening, folks. Hey, welcome to another episode of the Marketing Your Practice podcast. The podcast where I have the pleasure of simplifying the marketing and the mindset so you, the chiropractor, can increase your impact, your income, and your enjoyment in practice too. Now, if you've been with me over these past few episodes, today's conversation is going to feel like the next logical step. And if you're just jumping in here now, then let me briefly set the scene before we go any further. Now, when it comes to practice growth, there really are only three problems that us as chiropractors ever face. The first one is that nobody knows this. This is a visibility problem, okay? We try and solve this with marketing. The second is nobody stays. This is actually a trust problem, okay? And the third one is that we feel like we have no time or freedom. Now, believe it or not, this is actually a leadership problem. Now, this short series has been designed to solve that third problem, okay? Now, not by working harder and not by adding more systems, but by changing how you lead. Now, again, just to review, in episode 446, we introduced you to the CEO check-in, okay? This was all about creating space to step out of doing and to start thinking like a leader. In episode 447, we explored the concept or the idea of the CEO transition. And this is to help you understand how so many chiropractors unintentionally become the bottleneck in their own practice. In episode 448, we unpacked decision fatigue. And this really explains why your head never really switches off and how it's often the decisions that you're carrying, not the work itself, that creates the pressure that you feel. And in the last episode, 449, we talked about ownership, okay? And how decisions stop coming back to you once they've been given a clear home. Now, today, we're going to take the next logical step, because once decisions have owners, a new question naturally appears. And here's what it is. How do standards stay high if I'm not involved in everything, okay? And that's exactly what this episode is going to be all about. We're going to talk about standard and structures, not in a corporate sense and not as rigid systems or scripts, but in a quiet architecture that's going to allow quality to scale without you having to need to hover over your staff all the time. So if you've ever worried about stepping back, that it means that standards are going to slip, or being less involved somehow means caring less, this episode is going to help you see things in a different way. So let's jump into it. Now, let's start first by naming the fear that shows up for a lot of chiropractors at this point. Once you begin to step out of the day-to-day, once decisions have owners, okay, once you're not involved in everything, there's a quiet worry that often creeps in, okay, and it's this. If I'm not there, then standards are going to drop, okay? Now, this fear totally makes sense. And most chiropractors didn't build their practice by being hands-off, okay? They built it by caring deeply, by noticing details, and by setting the tone. So when you start to step back, it can feel like you're removing the very thing that kept quality high in the first place, okay? But here's the reframe that's going to really matter for you. Standards don't slip because you step back, okay? They slip when standards live in your head, okay? When quality depends on your presence, your reminders, your judgment in the moment, it's fragile, okay? Not because your team doesn't care, but because the standard isn't visible, okay? And this is why so many chiropractors stay involved, okay? It's just in case. Not because they want control, but because they don't yet trust that the standard will hold without them, okay? Does that sound familiar? And this is where really important clarification matters. In the last episode, we talked about ownership, okay? Now, ownership is absolutely essential. It's what stops decisions coming back to you. But ownership on its own isn't enough to keep standards high over time. Ownership answers who holds the decision, but structure, okay, answers how the standard holds without you. So the solution isn't more involvement, it's better structure. Okay, let me say that again. The solution isn't more involvement of you, it's better structure. Now, structure isn't about rigid systems, it's about making the right actions obvious, even when you're not in the room. Now, once standards live in the practice instead of your head, meaning they're visible, they're agreed upon, they're supported by a simple structure, stepping back doesn't lower quality. What it actually does is it stabilises it, okay? Now, one of the biggest myths in leadership, especially for us as chiropractors, I see this all the time, is that quality is maintained through your presence, okay? That if you're there, if you're watching, if you're checking, if you're answering questions, then things stay high. And if you're not there, then things slip. Now, the reason that this belief is common is because early on, it's actually true, okay? In the early stages of practice, you are the system, your values, your standards, your judgment, your presence feels like the quality. But over time, this belief quietly becomes a trap because what really happens, gang, is this. Your presence doesn't create quality. Your presence covers the absence of structure, okay? Now, when you're involved in everything, you're constantly correcting, reminding, and you're smoothing things over. And because the outcome is good, it feels like the involvement is there for a reason. But remove yourself for a moment and then gaps start to become visible, not because people don't care or your staff aren't capable, but because the standard hasn't been made explicit, okay? This is why for so many of us, myself included, okay, stepping back can feel uncomfortable, okay? I'm going to give you a solution to all this in a moment, so stick with me, okay? Now, when this happens and you start to see a quality drop here, you're seeing where clarity is missing, and this is actually a gift, okay? It shows you exactly where structure is needed. It's feedback, okay? It doesn't mean that there needs to be more oversight, doesn't mean that there needs to be more effort, okay? It means there needs to be clearer standards. Now, once you see this distinction, leadership stops being about you being everywhere and starts being about designing what holds things together when you're not, okay? So now we can talk a little bit about structure, but we need to talk about it in the right way, not as in more systems to build or bureaucracy, okay, but as a quiet architecture, okay? Now, structure is simply what makes the right action obvious even when you're not there. Let me say that again. Structure is simply what makes the right action obvious even when you're not there. Now, in practice, that architecture has 4 simple parts: standards, triggers, feedback loops, and reviews. I'll say it again. The 4 parts are standards, triggers, feedback loops, and review cadence. We'll go into more detail about each of these, okay? Now, you don't need all 4 perfectly, but when one is missing, okay, standards are going to start to rely on your presence again, okay? So let's walk through each one of these. So first of all is standards. Now, standards, all it does is it answers a really simple question. What does good look like here? Okay, now maybe you might want to say, what does great look like here? Okay, not in your head, okay, not assumed, but clear enough that somebody else can do it confidently or can act confidently. Now, when a standard only exists in your mind, you have to be present to enforce it. But when a standard lives in the practice, quality becomes repeatable. Now, the second part there is triggers. Now, triggers answer this question, okay? When does this standard apply? Okay, it might be when a visit is missed, when a patient mentions improvement, when something falls outside of the norm. Without triggers, even good standards get used inconsistently, okay? We don't know when to use the standard, okay? And that's when questions start landing back on your lap, okay? Now, the third thing is feedback loops. Okay, now feedback answers this. Is this happening the way that we intended? Now, this is not about micromanaging. In fact, it stops you from micromanaging. It's about visibility. Feedback replaces you needing to hover, and this is missing in many chiropractic practices, okay? So instead of wondering, is this happening, you can see, okay? And finally, the fourth part here is a review cadence. Now, again, I'm going to go into more detail on all of these in a moment. But review answers this. Is this still the right standard? This is when you can step back on purpose. Okay, it's probably monthly, quarterly. We do this calmly. What review does is it prevents drift without constant involvement. Now, when we put all these together, these four pieces allow standards to hold without you having to be everywhere. It's like magic, okay? That's the difference between leadership that exhausts you and leadership that sustains you. This is what gives you freedom and more time. All right, so let's make this practical, okay? Because structure only matters if it helps you and your day feel lighter, okay? So let's take missed visits and recalls for example. The standard might be this. Missed visits are followed up quickly, ideally within 10 minutes. They're done kindly and consistently. The trigger is clear, okay? A patient doesn't show for their appointment. Now, the feedback loop might be simple. It might be a daily or a weekly note showing how many missed visits were rebooked, all right? Okay, the feedback loop is a daily or weekly note showing how many visits were rebooked. And the review cadence, okay, is a monthly look at recall rates to see if anything needs to be adjusted, okay? Now, notice what's missing, okay? What's missing here is any need for you to hover, for you to chase, or for you to hold anything inside your head. Now, this standard is going to hold because there's structure to support it, okay? So let's take something different. Let's look at Google reviews. The standard is we ask for reviews when a patient mentions improvement. The trigger is a patient says they're feeling better or noticing progress, okay? The feedback loop might be a simple count of how many reviews came through that week. And the review cadence in this situation might be a quarterly conversation about whether the approach still feels natural and effective. Now, again, you're not involved day to day, but the quality is going to stay consistent, okay? Because again, we've got the standard there, we've got a trigger, we've got a review cadence inside there and feedback loops as well, all right? So let's look at one more example here, the report of findings checkout. Now, this is a critical moment in a patient journey because it directly affects retention, revenue, and clarity in practice. The standard could and should be something like this. Every patient leaves a report of findings clear on their plan, booked in for their next visits, and understanding their financial commitments, okay? The trigger for this one is simple, okay? The patient completes their report of findings. Now, the feedback loop might be something like this, a simple weekly snapshot showing how many patients booked follow-up appointments, okay? And how many prepaid or committed to care. Now, this isn't about judging performance in the moment. What it is about is just visibility. So you don't have to hover. You don't have to micromanage. Now, the review management or review cadence for this might be a monthly review to see if those numbers are trending in the right direction or whether some part of this process needs refining, okay? Now, in each case here, what I want you to do is notice the pattern, all right? And that is standards are clear. Triggers are obvious, there's feedback to create visibility, and there's reviews to prevent drift, all right? This is how quality holds, not because you need to be present, but because the structure is doing its job. Now, one more important nuance here is how often feedback and review happens, because not everything needs the same level of attention, and trying to review everything at the same time is exactly what's going to create more overwhelm. Now, a simple rule to remember is this. The higher the impact and the risk, the more frequently that it gets reviewed, okay? The more stable the process, the less often it needs attention. So something critical like recalls or missed visits, where a small drift can have really big consequences, okay? This benefits from frequent feedback and regular review. Now, whereas something like Google reviews, once this habit is established, okay, might only need a quarterly check-in. But feedback, what it does is it keeps things on track, and reviews decide whether anything needs to change, okay? Now, when those rhythms are right size, standards are going to stay high in your practice without you needing to be involved in everything. Now, at this point, there's a really practical way to bring all of this together, okay? And it's through a very simple shared snapshot, okay? It's not a complex system, not a software that you need to log into every day, but just a small visible place where the most important feedback loops live. Now, the purpose of this shared snapshot, okay, isn't to manage people, it's to move awareness out of your head and into the practice, okay? So here's the filter that matters, okay? The higher the impact, remember we said this before, and the risk, the more frequently it gets reviewed. This means there's only a handful of things that belong here. For example, missed visits, how many were rebooked this week within the last 24 hours, report of findings, how many patients booked their next visits, and how many committed to care. Internal referrals, how many referral packs were handed out, and how many introductions came through. That's it. Now, key to think about here, if the number doesn't change decisions or behavior, it doesn't belong on the dashboard, okay? This is a snapshot, okay? It's not something to react to in the moment. So, for example, in Lauren's practice, the snapshot lives on a simple whiteboard in the staff room, okay? It's visible to everyone. It's really easy to understand at a glance, and it's updated as a part of the normal rhythm of the week, okay? Now, that visibility matters, not because it's there to create pressure, but it's there as shared accountability amongst the office staff. When everybody can see how the practice is going, ownership becomes collective, okay? And standards stay front of mind without everybody being policed, okay? It's something that you can review calmly during your CEO check-in. Now, you're not asking who messed up here. You're asking, what is this showing me? Now, over time, this does something really powerful, and this is where motivation really matters. When standards are clear, people don't feel controlled, okay? They actually feel trusted. And clarity doesn't limit autonomy, it actually creates it. And this is really important for motivation there too, okay? And it stops standards from drifting without you having to hover. So this dashboard becomes a place where structure holds. So again, many ways that you can do this. We just have a whiteboard in our practice with the key data on it, okay? The most important data, and you get to decide what that is in your practice. Now, before you think about building dashboards or changing everything, let's slow right down. This is, again, not about implementing all of this at once, and it's definitely not about you needing to have perfect systems, okay? Leadership changes when you choose where to begin. So here's a simple way for you to start. Choose just one high impact area, okay? Ask yourself this question. Where does small drift create big problems in my practice? Now, if it might be missed visits, it might be report of findings, conversions, it might be something else entirely in your practice. Now, once you've chosen it, okay, clarify the standard, identify the trigger, decide what simple feedback looks like, okay, and choose how it actually gets reviewed, all right? Now, remember, the feedback is probably going to be something that's going to happen daily or maybe weekly, and the review is more likely to be kind of monthly or quarterly. Now, you don't need new software. It might be a whiteboard or a shared document. It might be a simple spreadsheet. The format doesn't really matter, but clarity is what matters, okay? And once that one area is stable, okay, think of it a little bit like line markers on a road, okay? They don't slow you down. What they do is they actually let you move faster, but they let you do it more safely, okay? Without constantly needing to correct course. Now, you will absolutely feel this in practice. It shows up as freedom and more time. It'll show up as fewer interruptions, less mental load, more trust, okay? That's when you know that the structure is doing its job. All right. Let's bring all of this together. Over the last few episodes, we've been solving one core problem, and that is time and freedom, okay? You've learned how to step into the CEO role, how to recognize when you've become the bottleneck, how to move decisions out of your head, okay? And how ownership stops those decisions bouncing back to you. Now, today was the next layer, and this is all about how standards stay high without constant presence of you, without you needing to hover, okay? And we do this not through control, again, not through hovering or micromanaging, but through simple, intentional structure. When standards are clear, triggers are obvious, feedback creates visibility, and reviews happen on purpose, then quality does not slip, okay? What happens is it stabilises and your practice starts to become world class, as does your leadership. Now, if this episode helped you see where structure is missing, then don't rush to try and fix everything. Choose one area, decide once, and let the practice carry it forward. All right, folks. Thanks for all that you do. Keep saving lives, and I'll see you back here next week. Bye. If you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, you have to come and check out my Community Influencer Program. It's my monthly coaching program where we take all this material and I'll work with you to help you apply it, implement it, and systemize it. The Community Influencer Group Coaching Program is designed to help you increase your practice income, impact, and enjoyment. Join me over at anguspyke.com/join. That's anguspyke.com/join. I'd love to see you there.